Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Bottom Turtle Podcast. I'm Dr. Shannon Ray, and today I'll be reciting another poem. One is called "The Heart of Things," and like I always say, I want to say that I appreciate everyone who's listening to the podcast and who has listened to it from beginning until now. I think we're really starting to cook with gas here, guys. I think if you have been listening to this podcast the entire time and you are inundated in the language of the podcast, the model of reality associated with it, if you have come into a relationship with the spirit contained within, then at this point, certain ideas should program you differently than those who have no familiarity with the podcast. And in that regard, we are now cooking with gas because you should be able to hear me in a way that others simply cannot due to your relationship with me. And so the whole show itself is always focused on this idea of objectivity. You know, it's focused on this idea of creating a language. And a language, whenever you have a shared language, there's a shared model of reality. With a shared model of reality, there's a shared spirit. And with a shared spirit, there's shared vision. And with shared vision, there are shared perceptions, shared feelings, shared capacity to create. And so the nature of objectivity is one that is binding. It's like glue. It binds us together so that we can coordinate with each other and cooperate with each other and trust one another. And so if you remember from to agree or to not agree, that is the question. But recalling that episode, remember how much I focused on the role of consensus when it comes to creating objectivity and understanding that objectivity comes from agreement. And so prior to agreement, prior to the construction of objectivity, there is freedom. So you have the freedom to agree or to not agree. But once you agree, then you create an object. And the truth and meaning of that object is independent of any individual because everyone has agreed that it means something. It means something specific. And so that freedom to agree or not to agree, that's the spirit of subjectivity. Your freedom to agree or not to agree. And so to come into agreement is to give up your freedom. And in doing so, you create an object that is shared among all of those who have agreed to give up some of their personal freedom to name things, to say they have meaning, to create, to come together and create an object, which means to come together and create a shared spirit, a shared language. And I think of this process of giving up one's freedom to enter into a relationship with others as a contract. It is the social contract. And once you enter into a social contract to create an object, which is to create a language, which is to create a perception, you guys have all made a contract with a being associated with that perception. And you are all members of that identity. That identity is your intersection. It is your shared spirit. It is the identity for which you can say, I am. I am a chef. I am a comedian. I am a scientist. And so when you enter into this contract, you build a world, a realm of perception. And it is you abiding to the contract that keeps that world together. You, in relationship with all others who gave up their personal sovereignty to enter into a contract, are the creators and the stewards of the world, the perception, the spirit, the God that comes into existence from this process. And to violate the contract is to corrupt the world. It is to put the world at risk. It is to put the spirit's existence at risk, to not abide by the contract. And so as a scientist, what is my contract? My contract is that when I do science, I do it honestly and sincerely. I do not fabricate data and make things up to advance my reputation. I don't lie. I don't use the mask of a scientist to inject my political views. I don't say, I'm asserting this with the authority of a scientist, but really I'm asserting it because I want to elevate or inject another identity of mine into this world without all other scientists realizing it. That is a betrayal. That is sin. That corrupts the world. It threatens the existence of the world. And so this process of entering into a contract means that you have a responsibility to all those others who have contributed their freedom to build the world, to agree to create an objective structure, a language. And so when you're in this world, everybody is equal. We are all the many gods, M-I-N-I, many. The many gods that come together to conjure the God of the realm of perception that we've created. We are the shards that reflect on one another that give rise to a being. We are the shards. We are the images of God. We are the images of God. And so this brings me into something I call the image of God principle, or the namaste principle. Because when you enter into this contract, you are saying, I recognize the divine creator in you, and that then the nature of the divine creator is the freedom. It's the freedom, the subjective freedom. As I say in the poem, that is your resource. It is the subjective freedom to have the free will to choose to enter into this contract. And that freedom is your divine freedom to create, your freedom to assert your will. And so in this regard, every being that comes together to make the world is a shard of God, an image of God. And you can see the spirit of objectivity working to hold this thing together. Because essentially, if you think of it in biblical terms, in terms of the Bible, then you have this principle that we're all made in the image of God. And then what is Jesus's first principle? Love God first, and then and that's the first one. The second one is love your neighbor as yourself. So what that means is that within the Bible, being made in the image of God means that each one of us has the divine spark of God. And I would actually argue that the thing that makes us an image of God is the capacity to be a creator. It is our free will. It's our freedom. It's our ability to create. That is the way in which we're made in the image of God. And so if each person has the divine spark of God, each person who's entered into the contract, and you elevate God above all else, then that means that you must respect the divine within each individual within the group. Because essentially what you've done is that you've taken the spirit of God and you've made it independent of any individual, right? So in other words, you have this thing like the Most High, like the Spirit of God is the Most High, right? Then you imbue the Spirit of the Most High in every individual, and then you take the Most High and you elevate that as the most important thing, which means that no individual within the group can elevate themselves above any other individual, because to elevate yourself above the other individuals who've entered into the contract is to elevate yourself above God. And so to properly respect God, you have to properly respect all of those who have come together to make the world. which means that you have an ethical responsibility to listen to them sincerely and to speak with them sincerely. So you have this responsibility from that. And the definition of what it means to have a God complex is to try to elevate yourself above others, which is to say, try to dominate them, try to dominate their free will, try to divine their divine essence of God. It is to say, you have to do the things the way that I say they have to be done. It is to try to dominate other people's free will. And it's also to bring in another identity that you have and to use the mask of the agreed identity to inject the spirit of some other identity. And one of the examples I always use, is one of my favorite examples, is Eunice and I watch Gordon Ramsay shows, right? Everyone knows that who listens to this podcast. And in Hell's Kitchen, Gordon Ramsay splits the teams up into men and women. So he often has these competitions where men and women will go head to head, where individuals on each team create the same dish, and then they bring it to Gordon Ramsay and an external judge, and whoever has the most points at the end of this competition after all of the people on the team have competed against each other wins the challenge. All right. And so imagine one of the external judges comes in and everyone agrees they're playing the game of cooking, right? And so the shared identity that everyone has is the spirit of cooking, right? So that's the game. And everyone is an equal in that game. And so imagine that one of the external chefs is a guy. Like imagine he brings in a man. And he knows that the men and women are competing with each other. And so when he judges their food, he gives the men points so they can win, even if he believes that the woman had the better dish. That right there is a sinful act. It is a poisoning of the world, because you're using the authority that has been given to you as being a chef in the world of cooking to elevate your other identity, which is the spirit of being a man or being male. That is what it means to not be sincere. And that is what it means to elevate that spirit of male over the spirit of chef, and to do it in a deceitful way in which you're using the mask as chef to inject and elevate this other identity. And so that is the heart of corruption. That is the heart of create separation, because prior to that, when we enter into this contract with each other, we are coming together to be part of something greater than ourselves, the larger identity for which you are one member of. As I've been saying in the podcast, that larger identity you've created is the macro state, the state of chef. And then all of your sub identities, like, being a male or a woman, that those are higher resolution data that distinguishes one chef from another. So these are micro states. So the macro state is the shared spirit that we all come together and create by entering into a social contract with each other. And then all the individuals, all the things made in the image of God, all the shards are the things that give rise to that macro state. And so to me, all of this lays the foundation of ethics. So for me, the Bible in Genesis, because this is Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. And if you talk to any Christian, this idea of being made in the image of God is actually very important to understanding and reading the rest of the book and what it means. And I think that if you have this image of God principle, this namaste principle, as I call it, I call it both of them, and you then take Jesus's first and second law, love God first, then love your neighbor as yourself, it's saying something like, we all come together to make the world, and to do that, we sacrifice our personal sovereignty to conjure into existence a spirit or a being, and then you love that spirit above anything else, which is to say and you love that spirit above everything else because all the other members of the group are infused with that spirit of God. So and then that sets everything as an equal playing field so that you don't get a God complex and try to elevate your spirit above other people and try to dominate them and control their freedom and free will. And then with that as a prerequisite, you are then able to love your neighbor as yourself. And this is like the foundations of all of ethics as far as I'm concerned. It's absolutely beautiful. And so I wrote something, I call it the foundations of ethical arguments. And so I'm just going to read what I wrote. All right, the foundations of ethical arguments. All questions concerning whether or not a behavior is ethical can be posed in terms of sin, where sin is defined as a betrayal of the self. Paradoxically, this is synonymous to posing all questions in terms of the responsibility of the self to the other. This is due to the principle of dependent origination, which is the principle that there is no self independent from relationships to others. Therefore, the separation of self from others is an illusion or a choice. Once one comes to an understanding of what has been identified as the self, they now know their responsibility to the others that constitute that self. So, just think in terms of the macro state and micro state example I just gave. That is, they know who they consider a citizen, which is to say, they know who has been given the grace of God, which is to be in the image of God. Once the grace of God is understood and given, then to betray your responsibility to the other is to betray the responsibility to the self, is to turn away from God, is to sin. And so in the Bible, the first sin is the thing that creates separation from God. And so sin creates separation. This is what the spirit of Satan is. Like if you read the Bible, it's always talking about like the spirit of Satan is the spirit of lies and delusion. It creates separation because the more you inject, the more you have a person who has entered into this contract to hold together the world and is deceiving others and is putting on the mask of the spirit of the world, but then injecting other things into it. You're degrading the purity of the world. And you're degrading the trust that people have created to come together to create a greater whole. And so sin creates separation. Sin creates separation. And one thing that people might be thinking when they're listening to this is that when I'm talking about God in this way, people are like, this God you're talking about, like the spirit of chef is not a God. Well, the way that I think about this is this process of entering into a relationship with others to create a world. This is the general process for creating a spirit or a perception or a God of a realm. So in the poem, I always use lowercase g God. But you can create like the pure spirit of the spirit of martial arts, the pure spirit of being a chef or cooking. You can create this pure spirit of that, and any process for that creates a God is going to have this, namaste principle. And so the spirit that creates gods, or from which all gods are developed, there's something like you have like the ultimate God. So for me, whenever you think of the idea of Jesus as being the King of Kings, I think of each one of these gods, these lowercase g gods, is like a king, and then Jesus is the king of all of them. Because this is the spirit of objectivity, which is the spirit of constraints, which is the spirit of coming together to create a larger whole, to create a larger identity. And then, of course, what you start to see is that every shard, every microstate that makes up the macro state has a bunch of identities, a bunch of intersecting identities. So if you go back to Purity and the Void, I talk about your interference pattern, like your intersections. And so what you have is that if you have the spirit of a physicist, right? You have the spirit of a physicist like myself. That is one macro state that makes up me. But I also have the spirit of, a martial arts hobbyist. And so that's another part of my identity. And so I live in both worlds. And so I am the intersection between those two worlds. But what that means is that in this process of ethics, as I'm describing it, which comes to responsibility of the others that create your worlds, in the ethics, then I have to be responsible to both the spirit of martial arts and the spirit of physics. I have to hold that responsibility in the same way in every single world that I live in. And then this is the process in which I'm trying to say, let's create a shared reality. Let's understand how language and objectivity and how these things work at a level to which everyone can agree and which is fair, so that we can understand, like we were mentioning in the episode Follow the Symmetries, where it was like, where Oyani was using the example of a Scrabble board, where like you can see where everything follows. This came from that. This came from that. People who put boy in the corner of the board are just like, can you get rid of that? We can obviously see that doesn't belong here. Like, this is the point of the podcast, to create that shared spirit, and for all of us to come together and take all of our unique interference patterns to create a pure realm of perception in which we all see each other as one. And this is the thing about the spirit of Jesus, why he's the king, is that Jesus is the purifying spirit. Like, I know people who aren't Christian who hear this, they might really mess with their mind, but the more I read this book, the more I come to know the spirit within it, the more I am convinced of this. And Jesus is the purifying spirit. I mean, that's the reason why in the Bible, the thesis of the Bible is you have the original sin, which is due to a betrayal of self. You knew you shouldn't have done this, but you did it anyway, and you made a justification for doing something you know you shouldn't have, which created a separation from you and God. That is sin. And so you have this separation that then kicks you out of the garden, because instead of having this loving relationship in which there's no delusions and lies, now you're in this realm in which you have to figure things out, and there's all this deception in it, and it's a very difficult world to live in. So then, now we live in the world of sin, which creates corruption and separation and delusion and suffering. And then you have Jesus that comes along and mends that sin. It gives a solution to the problem of sin. And so if you have a solution to sin, then you have a solution to separation, which then binds everyone back together. But it requires being sincere and honest and not delusional. And so it's like the spirit of Christ is like the blueprint for constructing all other spirits. If we want to construct a pure spirit of martial arts, then you're going to have to follow this made in the image of God principle, plus Jesus' first command and his second command. Otherwise, you get problems of trying to elevate yourself above the other people who've come together to make the God, to make the realm of the God, or the realm of perception, the realm of the spirit you're conjuring or bringing into existence. I just let me see. Like, there's something I want to end this on. This little rant. It's actually only 30 minutes, so that's good. There's a part in John where Jesus is praying. And I just remember it was so powerful when I read it. So let me see if I can find it. Yeah, let me just start reading. My prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one. Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we are one. I in them and you in me. May they be brought to complete unity, to let the world know that you sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me. It's like a plea that people love each other and become one. Like, there's another part where he's just like, please just let them love each other. Like, he's like begging, like, please just let them love each other and become one. It's just, yeah. All I know is that I am being as sincere as I can be. Like, I'm not trying to give anyone any deceit. I don't want to lie to people. Like, I'm trying to give you pure truth as much as I understand it. And I hope that people can hear this and it can resonate with them. And one thing that I forgot to mention is that when you have the namaste principle, or the made in God's image principle, what does it mean to listen sincerely? given that principle. And my argument is that to listen sincerely is to sacrifice yourself to the person you're trying to communicate to, which is to say that you are trying to sacrifice all of your conditioning. You're trying to sacrifice the way you see things to see them the way they see them. And one of the best examples I can give is I remember I was talking to a friend of mine at work, this brilliant guy. He's actually Muslim, but he has a background in computer science and psychology. And, my job, you just run across people like this all the time. Just brilliant people everywhere. And I remember I was talking to him about some of the ideas on the podcast. And for those who listen to this show regularly, they know how I use the word program, like we're programming each other. And so I used that word while talking to him. I said that I'm programming you. And after I got done talking, he said, when you use that word program, I have a negative connotation with that word. Like I don't like the way it feels. I don't like it. But he says, but I know you, and I know that you didn't mean it that way. And so I had to let go of my understanding of the word and how I feel with it to try to see it or experience it the way that you mean it. That's the essence right there. That's the essence. You have to, and that's actually something about the word namaste is it's associated with the idea of prostrating. I'm prostrating to you. I'm seeing the divineness in you. And this idea of prostrating is this idea of saying, okay, I will allow you to create a world for me, create a realm of perception, create a reality, create a God, and I will consider it and live in it sincerely. And whenever people are clinging to an identity, it is very hard to let go long enough to listen to others sincerely, because sometimes these new ideas might challenge an identity that you have. What if you have an identity that's built on delusion and lies? Do you think that it wants to be exposed to things that could demonstrate it to be false? Because if it's demonstrated to be false and delusional and deceitful, then you might stop believing in it. And if you stop believing in it, then you stop being a member of holding together the world of that perception. And so the spirit, the being associated with that perception will die. And so it doesn't want to die. And so what can it do instead? It can take in data that would purify it and manipulate it so that when it's actually heard and received by you, it's manipulated in a way to where it's not clear. It's manipulated in a way to where you don't see that there is an evil spirit or a delusional or deceitful spirit that you've attached to. So this process of manipulating data or not letting go of your perception a lot of times can be due to fear, because you're clinging to another identity that might die. And if you are attached to that identity, if you identify with it and think that is me, then you feel threatened because you are attaching to the spirit of the identity. So it is you. It is you and it's not you. It is you and it's not you. And if you're someone who has something like a fealty to the spirit of truth, the spirit of being sincere, the spirit of honesty, it doesn't matter. You will let your guard down because you have the spirit of truth. If someone's trying to deceive you, you'll see it. You don't go through the world fearful. If someone's trying to deceive you, you'll see it. This isn't logically sound. This isn't followed. This doesn't make sense. I've opened up and let you speak to me. And I've allowed you to give words. I've sincerely considered it. And after sincerely considering it, I've noticed that there's some issues here. This does not follow a logically sound structure. But I allowed you to communicate. I didn't just dismiss what you had to say outright. I listened sincerely. And this is what came back after that. Don't lie to yourself. Don't be delusional. Don't sin. And another thing that I was going to say was this process of sinning. It also is associated with the process of saying, I disagree. Because what I've noticed is that sometimes people use the phrase, I disagree, to avoid agreeing with obvious things so that an object isn't created. Because remember, once you agree, then you've created something like a stone, an object. This thing has meaning now. And because you've created that object through a language, then you have a causal structure. That language has to have a causal structure. So you can predict the future. See, again, the episode to agree or to not agree. And so once it has a causal structure, then it becomes mechanistic. When X, then Y. So it becomes an algorithmic process. It becomes a process with logical consequences. A, therefore B. A is true, therefore B is true. Modus ponens. What logic does is it takes the truth value from E and it transfers it to B. And so once you have an object, you create a language, which creates a causal structure, which then creates something like something objective. And so if you are using an argument that's based off deceit and lies, and you don't want it exposed, it is within your interest to say, oh, I disagree. Even if it's something as obvious as taking a wine glass and smashing it on the ground. And the problem is that for obvious things, like jumping off a building and falling on your head and dying, for obvious things, when someone disagrees with something like that, you know they're being dishonest. Like this is a delusional person, or they're being dishonest. Something's wrong with them because they're not agreeing on something that is so obviously true. But when it comes to things that are a little more complicated, just slightly beneath that layer of what's obvious, like social interactions and how language works, now suddenly someone can say they disagree and it's not obvious. Are they obfuscating, or is there something, a genuine disagreement here? But I would argue is that one way you can identify someone who is full of sin and deceit is whether or not they're disagreeing with things that are obviously true. Because when they say they don't agree, they do not create the spirit, the shared language, the shared spirit, which means that things are still up for debate. There is no object. There's nothing solidified. It's a very good way to deceive oneself. And it's associated with the idea of not letting your guard down enough to listen to someone else sincerely. So, surprisingly, this turned out a lot better than I thought it would. I think that this will be what I upload as the episode. I don't know. I hope you guys can hear me. I hope you guys can hear my spirit. Like, I want you guys to hear me, because the thing is I want to give you my sight. I want to give you my sight. I want you to see with the spirits that I have come into relationships with. I keep on, all right, this is the last thing I'll say for sure. I'm sorry, I keep rambling, but, once the context is created, I gotta put whatever I can in there while it's still there. Otherwise, I have to reconstruct new context to communicate an idea. But yesterday I was talking to Eunice, and I came to a realization of the concept of space. And what it is like, Eunice has a master's degree in English, right? She's a teacher. And so she does not have an understanding of what it's like to be a mathematician, to live in the world of physics, to have a relationship with all the equations, and like, she doesn't know all that math, right? But she knows it exists. So for Eunice, it's something like, okay, I have a very vague understanding of that world. I know it exists, but I can't see it in detail. I have a very low resolution relationship with it. So when you think of low resolution, think of it for her as being something very far away. It's like, think of it in terms of like a galaxy cluster really far away. Like, you can look up and you can see that there's something there, but you're not on the planets there. You're not in that galaxy. You don't know exactly what's going on. You can see the outside, and like that outside is something like an image or a projection of what's inside the galaxy. And when you're really, really far away, like that's all you have is like this outward projection. And so think of that as like that galaxy very far away that you kind of have this vague projection of. Like think of that as the world of science and mathematics. Like think of that as that galaxy. And for Eunice, it's very far away. But for me, I live there. So for me, it's not something very far away. Like I live there. I have the high resolution data of what's going on in that entire thing. And so when I'm trying to communicate my spirit to you, I'm trying to give you the detail of what's in there. And then the more details you get, think of it as getting closer and closer and closer. As I communicate my spirit to you, that galaxy is getting closer and closer and closer to your face. And that process of it getting closer is space travel. You see, you're traveling in the space of configuration, in the space of spirits. I'm trying to bring you into my world so that you can see. Anyway, thank you to everyone who still listens to this podcast. I love you guys, and this is a communication that comes from love, and I hope that people can hear that. Without further ado, here is The Heart of Things by Dr. Shannon Ray. Peace. Buddhism is true. This is an obvious fact. The Buddha is not a liar. His Dharma is true, not false. It is clear that at the center of one's whole is emptiness. At the center of one's identity is emptiness. At the center of one's power is emptiness. Emptiness is entropy, and entropy is due to a lack of constraints. And a lack of constraints is freedom. Freedom to feel how one wants. Freedom to create how one pleases. Freedom to create an identity. This freedom is your conscious right. It is your right as a creator. We all start from this source, and this source is our resource. Our resource that allows us to contribute to the state of reality, to determine what reality is. When entering into a relationship, we offer our resource to the greater whole, the greater identity. Each contribution gives life to that identity. It gives life to that being. It gives life to that God. That God is a creator. But all gods are created from this process of individuals sacrificing their resource to create structure, to create constraints. Because when constraints are placed, there is less emptiness. And when there is less emptiness, there is less freedom. There is less resource. But because all gods are given life through this process, the spirit of this process is the God of constraints, the God of objectivity. This sacrificing of our freedom, our resource, to enter into relationship with our God is our contract with our God. It is our contract with each other. It is our social contract. It is to sacrifice some of our sovereignty, our freedom, to be part of the larger whole. But to enter into this contract is to recognize the divine spark of all those who came together to create the world of that God, which gives it life, which gives it power to create. It is to see the image of God in each shard who enters into relationship with each other to hold together the world.